Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue on with our discussion of traditional arguments for realism about universals. We'd gone through the first one, the formal cause argument. The realist about universals argued that the best explanation of Morris, Felix, and Garfield, and so forth, all belonging to the same kind, namely cat, is that they share a common quality of catness or being a cat or felininity. And that explains all of them being cats, because if you have felininity, it logically follows that you're a cat, and that would be true of each of them, so we'd have an explanation. At first, the nominalists, though, seemed hard-pressed to come up with anything that would explain why Morris, Felix, and Garfield, and so forth, are cats. They tried saying that they all satisfy a definition of being a cat, but they really couldn't come up with a definition of what it is to be a cat that would truly provide necessary and sufficient conditions. And there would seem to be some shareable predicates like red or sweet or sour, which, at least according to empiricism, which many nominalists incline toward, would be primitive or undefinable terms that could not be defined verbally, but only by pointing to a sample, which is called an ostensive definition. It's not a verbal definition. You're just saying, what I mean by sour is the way that this tastes. Then you're not really giving a definition of sour in any verbal terms. Likewise for red or purple. In other words, you can only come to understand the general term red or purple by having perceptual acquaintance with a sample of that, but you can't define it in words. So if someone was congenitally blind, you could never get them to really understand what purple or red was. Not until they actually had a moment of actual vision would you be able to point them to a sample of that. But the nominalist would need a verbal definition to explain why all red things are red or all cats are cats. Then he could say, well, each of them meets the definition of a cat, each of them meets the definition of purple. So that explains why they're all purple or all red, but it doesn't seem to be the case that all terms that have general application to multiple things, can be verbally defined. And there were other accounts that we went through that didn't seem too promising. The most promising approach for the nominalist took them outside the realm of austere nominalism, that is like really bare bones nominalism, where you say only believe in material things. The most promising account seemed to be the trope theory, which would say that each of the three cats has its own particular catness. So then the nominalist is admitting the existence of qualities, which are not material bodies. But what they're saying is that these qualities are spatiotemporally located particulars that have spatiotemporal parts. So they're saying that a particular cat has its own unique catness, which is sort of there in space-time, coinciding with that cat. And a particular red thing would have its own particular redness. And so if you had two exactly similar red things, they would still have different particular rednesses. Even if the shade was exactly identical, there would be two numerically different rednesses, the redness of that one and the redness of that one. And if you had a third one, there'd be the redness of that one. if the shades of red were slightly different, like one was brick red and the other was rose red, and the third one was carmine, and another one was vermilion, and so on, or scarlet, then there would be different particular rednesses too. The difference between the two cases would be, in the one case, the nominalist would say that the two particular rednesses have perfect resemblance or exact resemblance, where the two have exactly the same shade. They exactly resemble each other, but they're still two different particulars. The redness of this apple and the redness of that apple would be two different particulars which exactly resemble if the shades are exactly the same. If the shades, though, are different shades of red, then they would resemble, but not exactly. Like, say, the redness of a rose and the redness of a fire engine. They have a resemblance, but it's not an exact resemblance. So there'd still be some resemblance. Just like any two humans that you pick resemble each other, but not exactly, unless they're perfect twins. And even then, they probably wouldn't exactly resemble. There'd be some slight differences between them, very likely. But in any event, so each cat would have a different catness to it. And what explains why all three are cats is two factors put together, that each has its own particular catness, and that the particular catnesses in question resemble each other. They form a circle of resemblance whereby the first catness resembles the second resembles the third, and the third resembles the first. So if you put those two together, that each has its own particular catness, and all the catnesses resemble each other, forming a circle of resemblance. According to this account, that would explain why Morris is a cat, Garfield is a cat, and Felix is a cat. It's they're each having a particular quality where the qualities resemble one another. So this means expanding the ontology of nominalism so that it's just not pure materialism anymore, but would include these particular qualities. So that would be a deficiency from the point of view of Occam's razor, because you're introducing more categories of entities. On the other hand, you still are avoiding introducing any abstract entities or any universals. You'd still have only concrete things and particulars on this kind of explanation. Any question about that? So that would seem to be the way out for the nominalist. The explanation, however, does lead to an infinite regress, because you can then ask, in virtue of what do each of the pairs of cats resemble one another? So Morris and Garfield resemble one another, and Garfield and Felix and Morris. So we can say that each of these pairs of cats have a resemblance, either an exact or an inexact resemblance, depending on whether they're absolute twins from the same litter or are not. Whatever. So then we could say, well, there must be something about each pair which accounts for the fact that in each of those pairs, the two things in the pair are both similar or both resemble. And this something can only be their resemblance. So therefore resemblance exists, which is a universal relation rather than a universal property. This sort of argument was first put forward by Russell in the Problems of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell. So if you go to page 90, let's see, page 96, he says, He's talking about triangles instead of cats or red things. He says the beginner, when he's talking about doing geometry, he says the beginner, in order to avoid error, often finds it useful to draw several triangles as unlike each other as possible, like different kinds of triangles, like obtuse and right triangles and so on, scalene triangles, in order to make sure that his reasoning is equally applicable to all of them. But a difficulty emerges as soon as we ask ourselves how we know that a thing is white or a triangle. If we wish to avoid the universals whiteness and triangularity, if we wish to avoid those, if we're nominalists, we shall choose some particular patch of white or some particular triangle and say that anything is white or triangular if it has the right sort of resemblance to our chosen particular. So we'll take like a paradigm patch of white or a paradigm triangle and say that something is white or a triangle if it resembles the chosen patch of white or triangle. But then the resemblance required will have to be a universal. Since there are many white things, the resemblance must hold between many pairs of particular white things, and this is the characteristic of a universal. It will be useless to say, so here's where the trope theory comes in. It will be useless to say that there is a different resemblance for each pair. And that would be what the trope theorists would say. We have this particular resemblance and this particular resemblance, this particular resemblance. Not only different particular triangularities or whitenesses or catnesses, but also different particular resemblances, the one between these two triangles and then the one between these two triangles and the one between these two triangles. Each of them is a different concrete particular resemblance. That resemblance isn't a universal. It will be useless to say that there's a different resemblance for each pair, for then we shall have to say that these resemblances resemble each other. And thus at last we shall be forced to admit resemblance as a universal. Thus the relation of resemblance must be a true universal. And once we're forced to admit this universal, we find that it is no longer worthwhile to invent difficult and unplausible theories to avoid the admission of such universals as whiteness and triangularity. So he's saying once you let in resemblance as a universal, you've admitted there are universals, so you may as well let in whiteness and catness and triangularity and so on. So he's making a kind of infinite regress argument here. He's saying you'll need to keep on introducing more and more particular resemblances. Particular resemblances first between original particulars, between the cats, say, or the triangles or the white things, and then particular resemblances between them, and particular resemblances between their particular resemblances, and particular resemblances between those other higher order particular resemblances, and you'll have to keep on going and going and going. We saw, though, last time that the that the realist, whether Platonic or Aristotelian, also wound up in a kind of regress as well. So it seems like both of these accounts are on a par with respect to that. At least at this stage of the game. So it looks like if we're going to be able to explain why all the cats there are cats, if we use a shareable universal, we'll get one account, and we can keep on asking more and more questions and generate more and more of these shareable universals, an infinite number. And the same seems true with the trope resemblance theory as well. So it's not clear, at least in terms of a metaphysical infinite regress, that the trope theory is worse off than the realist theory. They both lead to some kind of infinite regress of metaphysical explanations. I'll return to this matter later because there's another way to read Russell's argument here, where the regress isn't just a metaphysical one, but is rather more of a cognitive regress, having to do with how it is that we can grasp or apprehend the various universals. So more on that later. I want to turn next, though, to the abstraction argument, where actually this issue comes up. So according to the abstraction argument for universals, for shareable properties or relations, the first premise here states that we can perceive that Morris is a cat, Garfield is a cat, and Felix is a cat. So the only difference between these two first premises is, between the formal cause and the abstraction, is that the abstraction argument talks about perception or knowledge, whereas the formal cause argument just talked about the existence of cats. The abstraction argument brings in the issue of our having perceptual knowledge of the existence of cats. So what we're talking about here is the fact that we can perceive and therefore know, presumably, that a number of things fall under a given kind, in this case, in this example, the cat kind. So we can perceive that Morris, Felix, and Garfield are cats. And it seems to be perceptual knowledge that we're talking about in this particular case. Anyway, I mean, you might talk about a more general kind of knowledge that isn't perceptual. Like if somebody said, I can see that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all numbers, right? Then you'd be using the word see, not in a perceptual sense, but more in the sense of having abstract knowledge. I understand that. I understand it to be the case that 1, 2, and 3 are all numbers. In either event, we're talking about having a kind of knowledge of some sort or other, in this case perceptual knowledge with cats. Might be visual knowledge, might be auditory knowledge, tactile knowledge, or any combination of them. A blind person could say, hear the cats meowing, and then pet them, perceive that they were cats. A sighted person could visually apprehend that they were cats, and perceive it as well in many other ways. So there must be something, according to premise 2, about Morris, Felix, and Garfield, etc., which accounts for our being able to perceive that all of them are cats. So here we're being asked to explain how it is that we're able to acquire this knowledge or develop this knowledge that they're all cats. It's not being asked, as in the first argument, what is it in virtue of which are these things cats? But we're being asked to explain what is it in virtue of which we're able to know or perceive that all of them are cats. In each instance, though, it's being said that there must be something about these things which accounts for our being able to have this knowledge. There must be some common element in each of them which we apprehend in each of them, which then enables us to form the belief and then the knowledge that all of them are cats. And what could that be except for their catness? Mustn't it be that we apprehend some shared quality or property that exists or is exemplified in each of these animals? The quality of catness, which would then enable us to figure out in our mind that we're dealing with 3 cats here because each has the quality of catness, a quality which would guarantee that each is a cat. So we form a little bit of simple reasoning and come to the knowledge based on our perception, based on our observation that each of these creatures has the quality or property of being a cat, that all 3 of them are cats. The abstraction argument gets its name from the closely related theory which is presupposed by this argument, known as the abstractionist theory of concept formation. So according to the abstractionist theory of concept formation, which has a long history among philosophers, according to this theory, we can form a concept of something, like the concept of a cat, or of a triangle, or of red, or whatever, by generalizing or abstracting from our perceptions of particular instances or examples of those concepts. According to advocates of the abstraction argument, we can become acquainted with an attribute or quality, a shareable attribute or quality, by generalizing or abstracting from our perceptions of particular things which have that attribute. So the idea is when you're first learning things, say as a very young child, and say you're learning what a cat is, so you would see an animal, which is happens to be a cat, say for the very first time, you would perceive this, right? It's furry and four-legged, and has claws, moves around in a certain sort of way, right? Has whiskers. So you would observe all these things. And you wouldn't yet have the concept of a cat the very first time you saw a cat. But then the experience is repeated a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time. So you have these repeated experiences of that cat. At some point in that process, due to the similarity of these experiences, even though they may differ slightly, right? Like you may see one cat that's black and another cat that's white. But there are still more similarities than differences among the cats that you see. At a certain point, after having had sufficiently many experiences, it begins to dawn on you that there's a commonality among the creatures you've observed. And at that point, you generalize or abstract from these cases and begin to form a general concept of cat that applies to all of the examples that you've perceived up to that time. And then there are other things, right? Say pencils or tables or dogs, whatever, that are sufficiently dissimilar from these things, though similar to one another within their own group, that you abstract or generalize from them to form appropriate concepts of those things, and then on that basis come to grasp or understand what it is to have that attribute of being a pencil or a dog or a table, whatever. So this is known as the process of abstraction. In a way, it's a kind of inductive process because it's based on a repeated experience of something and then generalizing from that to universalize the experience one's had. So in the more typical inductions or enumerative inductions that we do, right, we observe, say, that the sun rises on Monday and then on Tuesday and then on Wednesday and on Thursday, and we conclude that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that the sun will continue to rise for a very long time till it runs out of fuel. And since it's very large, that will be a very long time. So in that type of induction, you're able to make a prediction based on a finite number of observations, that if the sun has risen before, it will continue to rise in the future, say. So you're able to reach certain epistemic conclusions about cases that you haven't observed. That's in a standard enumerative induction, right? Because you haven't observed tomorrow yet, but you're able to forecast that the sun will rise tomorrow because it's following the pattern that that you've observed in the past, that every 24 hours the sun will rise in the morning. So what's the analogy here to the case of observing, say, dogs? Right. Well, here you observe a number of dogs, say, that you're familiar with, like collies and cocker spaniels and dachshunds, Irish terriers, and different types of dogs, from which you develop a basic concept of dog, and then you come to understand what canininity is as an abstract shareable attribute by abstracting or generalizing from all these cases. The interesting thing here is, once you have that concept nailed down in your mind or your brain, right, once you've developed it, you can apply it to cases that are novel. So suppose you encounter a new type of dog that you'd never seen before, and this is after you've mastered the dog concept. Say you're 6 years old now, so you've got that down. Right? You're not like an 8-month-old toddler who's like pointing at different things, right? Maybe not fully understanding the difference between a dog and a cat yet. Just thinking it's a furry, cute thing or something like that. Sure. So by 6, you know dogs, right? So you might see a new type of dog at that point, though, that you'd never encountered before, like a Russian wolfhound. Say you'd never seen a Russian wolfhound. But you would say right away that's a dog and not a cat, right? Because it's sufficiently similar, it falls within this concept, you can recognize it as a dog to a high degree of certainty. Could you be mistaken? Yeah, could be. Might not be a dog. But chances are you've got it right because you know the concept. Right? Just like the sun might not possibly the sun could fail to rise tomorrow if some unforeseen cosmic catastrophe occurs. Right? But we don't expect that, right? And it's unlikely, though possible. So one can say one knows or has a highly justified belief, at least to a very high degree of probability, that the sun will rise tomorrow, and also that that creature that one perceives falls into the dog category, because one has that knowledge from the prior cases. So that's the sense in which this process of abstraction is a kind of induction. Through repeated experiences in the past, one acquires a power to classify objects that one has never seen before into that category. So if one saw the Russian wolfhound, they would know that it was like a novel type of dog that they'd never seen before, or they're really high, like spying. Or on the other hand, if you saw like some weird type of cat, like a saber-toothed tiger or something, you'd be able to identify it as a cat. Say at the Museum of Natural History, you saw a saber-toothed tiger dug out of the tundra in Siberia that was, frozen in a block of ice, right? Totally preserved, right? You'd be able to recognize it as a cat to a high degree of probability. So, all right, so that's the abstraction argument that we're able to classify or see that these things fall into these kinds because we can apprehend a shared quality among the things. So here too, the nominalist will have to come up with some alternative explanation of how that happens. They might turn to the trope theory again and try the same thing. Well, I perceive that each one has a particular catness and that these particular catnesses resemble one another. Right? But then Russell could come in with, well, then, but how do you know that these different pairs of things resemble one another? Because I perceive a particular resemblance that the members of each pair have to each other, and these three different pairs are such that the resemblances are particular resemblances that resemble one another, and so on and so on. If this leads to a cognitive regress, if it does, right, then we have I think, a more serious problem for the resemblance or trope nominalist. Because while there could be a metaphysical explanation that goes on forever, since the human mind is finite, it doesn't seem like there could be a cognitive regress involving an infinite number of inferential activities that the mind has to go through to identify a cat. Everyone get what I'm saying here? In other words, metaphysically, I guess we could just have these properties and resemblances and just going on and on and on. They would just exist, just like the numbers maybe just exist infinitely. But if we're talking about explaining how we can recognize something as a cat, it seems like the psychological process involved must be finite, since we don't have an infinite amount of time to go through an infinite number of mental activities. No matter how fast we could do them, it would still take more time than we've got. And most of us, frankly, aren't such quick reasoners that we could do, say, 10,000 levels a second or something like that. And the more complex they get, the slower we get at going through all these resemblances and higher order resemblances of resemblances and higher order resemblances. So if you can make the case that the trope theorist would need an infinite inferential intellectual process here in order to be able to identify these things as all cats, by Russell's argument, that we'd have to go through not only the resemblance of the catnesses, but the resemblance of their particular resemblances and the particular resemblance of those particular resemblances, and on and on and on and on forever, would seem like we could never be able to identify anything as a cat, and the trope theory would fail. It would still remain to be established that we'd actually have to go through such a cognitive regress. Maybe there'd be some way of just immediately knowing or something like that. But it's certainly an argument worth pursuing and examining. But it looks like, again, the trope account seems the most promising avenue open to the nominalist here, if that'll work. Like I say, it's at least arguable that the Russell regress would raise a problem from that. Unless we can just somehow, at one of these levels, just immediately apprehend the fact that the things resemble. But I'm not so sure why that should be. I mean, if we could do that, why couldn't we just immediately apprehend that they're cats? Right? Which doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like you have to learn what a cat is by noticing resemblances, basically, right? So it's not clear why the resemblance among resemblances would be any different as you go up the ladder. And in fact, they seem more abstract and more difficult to grasp than the resemblance of some cats, the resemblance among resemblances. And when you get up a couple of levels, you don't even seem to know what you're talking about anymore, right? So it may be that the abstraction argument makes an even more persuasive case for realism than the formal cause argument does. Something to think about anyway. Not claiming to have established that, but it's a line of thought. The third argument is the linguistic argument. Third argument for realism about universals. So according to the linguistic argument, which obviously has to do with language, so the first argument is purely metaphysical or ontological. It asks, what accounts for the existence of multiple cats? Second argument is epistemological. It asks, how can we pick out or identify a number of things as cats? In each case, it's answered only if there are shared properties which determine a thing's membership in the kind that it belongs to, like catness or dogness. The linguistic argument asks how a single word or term, such as cat, and this is indicated by the little quotation marks around the word cat there. So it says the term C-A-T, so the quotation marks tell you that we're talking about the word and not the animal. So the term cat denotes or refers to Morris, Felix, and Garfield. So when you use that word, you're referring to those types of animals out in the world, right? You're not referring to Rover, Fido, and Spot when you use C-A-T. You're talking about Morris, Felix, and Garfield, right? So premise one seems true. Then premise two says there must be something about Morris, Felix, and Garfield which accounts for the term cat, C-A-T, denoting all of them. And this something can only be their catness, therefore catness exists. So once again, we have an argument that is clearly logically valid. If its premises are true, then its conclusion must be true. So again, the nominalist must dispute one or more premises of the argument. The argument presupposes a theory of meaning, that Russell actually defended in the Problems of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell, or whom I referred to earlier. According to the advocates of the linguistic argument, for any general term, and that would include common nouns like dog and cat, adjectives like red and sweet and sour, verbs like running, to run or to walk, or running and walking, if you take the participle form, or prepositions like in, on, above, below, next to, between, and so on. The meaning of any of these sorts of general terms is an attribute signified by that general term. The attribute might be either a shareable property or a shareable relation, like catness or betweenness in the case of a relation. Thus, a general term T can be said to denote a group of objects O1, O2, O3 through ON, if and only if the attribute which that linguistic term signifies or means is exemplified by each one of those objects, O1, O2, O3, dot, 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 through ON. So what's being advocated here is the idea that the connection between words in our language, like cat, and things in the world, like Morris, Felix, and Garfield, is mediated by the shareable properties which those things, properties or relations, which those things exemplify. So it's saying that universals are integral to understanding the connection between our language and things in the world that our language refers to. So the question being asked really is, if you have a word or a term like cat in our language, and then you have these creatures in the world, in this case, Morris, Felix, and Garfield, clearly there's a connection between the word cat and Morris, Felix, and Garfield, but it doesn't seem to be any kind of absolute or natural connection. Clearly, if there hadn't been human beings who speak English, the symbol CAT would have nothing to do with Morris, Felix, and Garfield. Suppose the planet was totally uninhabited billions of years ago, and say some breezes in the desert like blew some sand around so that they formed like a C-shaped thing, like an A-shaped thing, and then a T-shaped thing, right? So that, as it were, cat was written out in the sand by the wind and the sand. Or if some rocks fell down in an avalanche and they lined up so that they formed like a C, A and a T, or whatever, right? Before there were any human beings, right? But there were cats roaming around back in, like saber-toothed tigers or something. Right? Then the word cat, that symbol, well, that physical object wouldn't refer to the cat. It wouldn't be a symbol. Wouldn't be anything, right? It would just be some random physical objects. It's like on Mars, right? They take these pictures and then people claim to see all kinds of things. Right? There's a statue of a woman right over there, right? Right? And it's just something that they see, right? If you look in the clouds, you can see all kinds of things, right? And interpret them as horses and dogs, but they're not really those things. We just see a similarity. Likewise, without language speakers, there wouldn't be any words or linguistic symbols that referred to these objects. So it seems like we need to tell some kind of story about how a certain symbol, CAT, gets linked up to Morris, Felix, and Garfield. And it seems like that story is going to involve, in this case, us as language users who speak English. And of course, in other languages, they'd have different symbols that they used that would be explained in some parallel fashion. Right? Say in Spain, it would be what? El gato for cat, right? So that would be the symbol that they would use. And in German, it would be Hund. So I have no idea what it is in Chinese. Something else. Totally different sound, right? So, but in each case, there'd have to be a story about how that word gets linked up with those things. Right? It doesn't happen magically, and it doesn't happen just in virtue of the geometric structure of the letters, right? Or the physical objects which we interpret or use to stand for those letters. Before there were people, those exact geometric forms were nothing but random concatenations of stones or dust particles that were not letters, which didn't make up words and which didn't refer to anything, right? So how did that happen? Well, it seems to happen like this, right? Going back to the formal cause argument, right? There are these 3 cats that exist, or 10 cats, or whatever. Cognitively, right, we perceive these things and form concepts of them which represent our grasp or handle or comprehension of the properties or relations that these objects have, which we abstract or generalize based on the similarity among the objects we've observed. So at that point we have concepts, right? Which seem to be, at least according to the realist model, are our mental representations or understandings or graspings of these shareable properties. So there's a shareable property of catness, and we form a concept of cat based on that. So then how do we get to the language stage? Well, at some point in a given culture or group, for the purposes of interpersonal communication, certain symbols, linguistic symbols, words, either spoken or written, in most cases, are introduced in order to signify or stand for these concepts or properties that we've managed to apprehend. So people, say in England, said, right, we're going to use the sound dog, which can be represented by D-O-G, by those written letters, to signify the property of caninity. And we're going to use the sound or the word cat to represent felininity and so on, to signify these qualities. And then we can communicate because we all use the same symbols to represent the same concepts or properties or relations. So the property of being a cat, that shareable abstract quality, will relate both to the cats, because they are cats by virtue of sharing, right, having in common that very same property. Each of them exemplifies that very property of felininity. So that links the animals to the property, right? So the animals are linked to the property by all of them having that property. They all possess the property of being a cat. So that's one linkage from the cats to the property. And then the property gets linked to the word C-A-T, the word cat, because we, by linguistic convention, use C-A-T, that symbol, to signify that very same quality. It provides the meaning of C-A-T. So according to this theory, the sense or meaning of C-A-T is the property of being a cat, the very same property that's shared by Morris, Felix, and Garfield, which then connects C-A-T as we use it to the cats in the world, Morris, Felix, and Garfield, through the medium of catness, which connects to both in different ways. It connects metaphysically or ontologically to the cats because they actually have that property and couldn't exist without having that property. So. And it connects to the word because the word would be meaningless or would mean something else entirely if it didn't signify that quality as opposed to no quality at all or some other quality. Like, say, in some other language, cat meant dog, whatever they use. Right? They use the sound cat to mean dogs in this other language. So. Or in some secret code, right? You're a spy, and whenever you say cat, you mean dog, and so on and so forth. Right? Which you can do, right? You could come up with some secret code to communicate with people. I saw some TV show where they said lots of younger people now have all kinds of codes that they use so they can text in front of their parents, to, like, their friends, and talk about all kinds of things they don't want their parents to know what they're talking about without their parents having any idea that they're doing that. Because they've invented a code with basically a manual, right, that's understood by all of the people in the group as to what stands for what. So you can do those kinds of things. So this is the linguistic argument. So it's often argued that the three arguments together, the formal cause, abstraction, and linguistic, form constitute a related group of arguments that, taken together, form a powerful case for the belief in the existence of shareable properties and relations, in that they can explain how things fall into kinds, how we're able to know that they fall into kinds, and finally, how our language and the words that we use can be linked up to things in the world such that general terms that we use refer to or denote certain groups of things in the world, such as dogs and cats and triangles and white things and so on. Any question or comment about any of this?
So for the formal cause argument,
yes.
the idea is the existence of it.
Existence.
For the extraction is perceptual knowledge.
Yeah.
The linguistic would just be language meaning.
For the linguistic argument, it's what explains the linkage between a word that has general application and the things in the world that we deem it refers to. So what connects the symbol CAT to Morris, Felix, and Garfield? Because there's no automatic connection. It's got to be explained, right? Explanation seems to be that by convention in our language, we use the word cat to signify a quality that Morris, Felix, and Garfield have, thereby connecting CAT to those creatures through the property. The property both is had by them, but also at the same time is what gives meaning to the word CAT. So this is based on the idea that words would have no meaning unless they signified or represented attributes, either properties or relations. So they're saying our language gets its meaning only because there's this world of universals out there. That if there were only particulars, language, we couldn't have a meaningful language. If there were only particulars, the only words that could be meaningful would be names. So if there were just particulars, like you could have a name of each, you could have like Morris, Felix, and Garfield, but you couldn't have that they're cats because, right? Cat's not a name of any particular. It seems to be the name of a shared quality. Or, more accurately, it's actually not a name at all. It's a predicate. Cat is an adjective or predicate which applies to each of these creatures. You could name each creature, right? But that would still leave out the quality, unless you say that there are qualities that can be named, right? In which case you're not believing just in concrete particulars anymore, but in shareable qualities like being a cat or catness. All right, so that's one kind of argument. Another argument that's been given is that, in favor of realism about universals, is that the very science of logic presupposes universals. This argument may date back to Aristotle. Aristotle was the inventor or discoverer, whichever you prefer, of the formal science of logic. He developed what was called a theory of syllogisms. A syllogism is a logical form which is always valid, having a certain structure. An example of a basic syllogism is all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore what? Good, all A's are C's, right? An example would be, say, all men, so we would substitute men for A, are animals. And then all B's, so what's B? Animals, right? So we have to put animals here. are C's, so that would be some third thing. Say mortal. C stands for mortal. So if all men are animals and all animals are mortal, then all A's are C's. All men are mortal. So the idea here is that if both of the premise statements are true and follow that form, then you must necessarily get a true conclusion out of that. The conclusion can't be false, assuming both premises were true. And then the question would be, in virtue of what does this necessary relationship hold? According to Aristotle, it's because it's necessarily true for any properties A, B, and C, that if all things that have A have B and all things that have B have C, then all things that have A have C, which would then say that logical validity depends on the existence of universals. The logical validity of a syllogism presupposes the existence of properties. Otherwise, what would account for the necessary validity of this particular syllogistic logical form, other than that it's a necessary truth necessarily for any properties A, B, and C, if all things having A have B, and all things having B have C, then all things having A have C. Can you come up with some other explanation that doesn't use properties? That would explain why it's necessarily true that if you follow that format, you would always get a true conclusion. Seems like a fairly plausible argument. Right? So the possibility of logical demonstration presupposes the existence of shareable properties or universals. That's one argument given. So more food for thought. Can the nominalist refute that by coming up with some other explanation? It seems if they try to do it linguistically, they're going to run into some problems. Instead of talking about properties, just talking about words. Because as we've seen, words can mean different things. It's contingent that a given word means what it means, or somebody using the word might mean something different than another person using the very same word, like if they were using a code, right, and so on. So it doesn't seem like it's necessarily true. If you turn the A, B's, and C's into not properties, but words, it's not so clear that you're going to get a necessary truth, right? Like maybe the first time somebody uses A, it means one thing, and the second time if they use it, it means something totally different. That seems possible. So that's the nominalist problem. It seems like you have a very straightforward, intuitive explanation here, anyway, of logical validity in terms of properties. Hard to see how you would do it without properties or at least some other kind of abstract entity. Though, of course, the specific issue here is universals. So if you're able to recast this in terms of some other kind of abstract entity, you wouldn't be a concretist anymore. But I mean, suppose you could do it in terms of sets. Say, you use set theory to explain this in terms of properties. Sets would be particulars, but they'd be abstract entities. So again, it wouldn't be an austere form of nominalism anymore. So perhaps there's a way to avoid properties and explain this, but it's very hard to see how you would avoid introducing some kind of abstract entity, at least sets, in which case your nominalism is not so simple anymore, right? with abstract entity. It's not just like, no, there are just bodies, or just particular qualities or something like that. So that's an interesting argument. Turning to another strategy that's been used to frame the debate between realists and nominalists, or between realists and concretists or particularists, depending on which version of nominalism you go for. One of the more recent approaches has been through the idea of what might be called ontological translation. So we start here with this basic idea that if there is a true statement about something, then the thing in question surely exists. So if there's the basic idea is if there's a truth about something, then it exists. So, for example, if it's true that that Rover is brown, if that's a true statement, I suppose it's false, right? Suppose Rover doesn't exist, right? Like I've told you this like false story that I have a pet dog named Rover, right, who's brown and stuff, right? So it's just false, right? I have cats, I don't have a dog. So then it wouldn't follow that Rover exists, right? Because it's a false statement. But suppose it's true, right? Suppose somebody utters the true statement that Rover is brown, then it seems to be the case that it follows that Rover exists, right? So the basic idea is that if there's a true statement about something, then the thing in question exists. Does that seem acceptable, or does anyone have a counterexample to that we could discuss? Are there truths about things that don't exist?
Like it's an illusion.
If there's an illusion,
I guess it's not technically exists.
well, you have to distinguish between
Concrete and abstract.
Well, you have to distinguish between the illusion and what the illusion purports to be. So the illusion exists, but I mean, if you're saying that there's a dog there because someone's put LSD in your Rice Krispies this morning or something like that, and you're hallucinating the dog, and you say there's a dog there, right, that Rover is brown, then that's going to be a false statement because it's about Rover, and Rover doesn't exist. If you're saying, I have a visual experience of a brown dog, that'll be true. But that's a different statement. So then the statement that that I have a visual experience of a brown dog will be true, and the visual experience will exist. So it's not a counterexample. On the other hand, if you say there's a dog there because of that visual experience, that'll be a false statement, and it won't follow that the dog exists, which is also consistent with this principle. So does that clear it out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other type of case where there might seem apparently to be a truth about something that doesn't exist? How about something like
About like when you go back with that unicorn theory.
Yeah.
Like you say like, well, unicorns have horns.
Right.
Like, well, yeah, they do. But
Yeah, that's true, right? Yeah, or
it doesn't necessarily follow that the unicorn is real even though it's true that they have horns.
Not even the Hulk can lift Thor's hammer. Right? Right? That seems true, right? You might argue, anyway. Right? You could argue that's true. So what should we say about this type of case? Well, I think there's two ways you could go, just like there were two interpretations. I think there are two interpretations here also, though I think it's a very different case than the case of an illusion. But I think there's also two options for dealing with this and still sticking to our principle, whatever. First of all, you might say that strictly speaking, that's false because Thor and the Hulk don't exist, and there is no such thing as Thor's hammer and so on. So you might just bite the bullet and just say it's false, right? Or you might say it's actually true but elliptical. You might say it's elliptical for, in the Marvel comic books, right? Or movies or whatever. Not even the Hulk can lift Thor's hammer. Right? In which case, now it is true, but it doesn't seem to imply that the Hulk or Thor's hammer exist. Because it's just part of a fictional... Now, the fictional thing exists, you could say, right? There are these comic books, and these fictional stories exist, but not the Hulk and Thor, right? They don't exist. What exists are the written stories, right? They exist. So I think we could go one way or the other with this. Or I guess there's a third way to go, even. I guess we could say that the Hulk and Thor do have some kind of existential status. If there's this truth about them. They were created by Stan Lee or somebody. Yeah. But if something was created, then mustn't it exist? So therefore, Sherlock Holmes and Thor and the Hulk and Superman and Green Lantern all do exist. Then the question would just be, what kinds of things are they? They're clearly not flesh and blood people or anything like that. You might argue that there's a realm of mental creations, which mythical and fictional creations belong to. That they're not they don't exist as flesh and blood people, but they exist as ideas in the minds of their creators and the people who follow their stories, so on. So they have a kind of existence, mental existence. So they exist in the way that something like the way that the hallucinated dog that somebody saw when they had mescaline in their Rice Krispies that morning, whatever. Right? They have a mental existence or some kind of existence that depends on certain mental constructs or whatever. So there are all kinds of things we can say. I don't think any of them, though, are going to involve us in abandoning that principle that we have. So it still remains true that if there's a truth about something, it exists, right? This is a tricky example which could be interpreted in view of that principle in a number of different ways. Okay? That makes sense? We could either say, yeah, they do exist, but they exist in some weird way, like in your mind or in the minds of their creators as ideas. Clearly, we don't want to say that they're actual flesh and blood people like that, whatever. Or we could say the statements are false, they don't exist, right? Or we could say that the stories exist, right? But not the creatures, because obviously the comic books and the movies exist. And, in them, right, these things are described. But we're not saying that Hulk and Thor actually exist themselves. So there are three different ways you could go, with variations on all of them. Okay, so we have this principle: if there's a truth about something, then it exists. Right? So suppose we have some truth then, right? Consider the truth that suppose we have the truth that Katniss is exemplified by that meowing thing. That seems to be true, right? You could replace Katniss with felininity, if you like, or the property of being a cat, or whatever, right? Something like that. The property of being a cat is exemplified by that meowing thing. That seems to be a true statement in ordinary parlance and ordinary English speech, which should provide us with our initial or prima facie metaphysical data for any metaphysical theory. Remember, we have to start with our folk ontology, that is, with the things we ordinarily say. Like we say, well, there's a table over there, or there's a brown dog over there, or felininity is exemplified by that meowing creature over there, and so on. So if this seems to be true, seems to be just as true as, saying that there's a meowing creature over there. So it would then, being a true statement, it would imply the existence of the things it's about. One of the things it's about is that meowing thing. So we can conclude that the meowing thing exists, which seems pretty harmless. That is, we can conclude, if we're nominalists, that because of the truth of this, there are cats, which is fine. But it also refers to Katniss, which does not seem to be a particular or a concrete thing. So what to do? Well, one possibility is to say that accept the existence of Katniss. Right? Katniss exists just as much as the meowing thing does. Right? They both must exist in order for this to be true. However, the nominalist is not eager to do that. So what the nominalist says is, one is just a stilted or fancy way of saying something that can be said more directly and simply, and that we don't need to bring in some kind of abstract or non-empirical entity existing outside of space or time or anything like that in order to account for the truth of this, because one is just a fancy way of saying that that meowing thing is a cat. So they would say, you can say one, but understand that one is just a fancy way of saying that that meowing thing is a cat. And that statement doesn't imply the existence of anything abstract. And this is called an ontological translation. One prime is an ontological translation of one. An ontological translation must fulfill the following two criteria. First of all, it must be logically equivalent to the original statement, such that necessarily one of them is true if and only if the other is true. So necessarily, if that meowing thing is a cat, Katniss is exemplified by that meowing thing, and vice versa. Necessarily, that meowing thing is a cat, if and only if, Katniss is exemplified by that meowing thing necessarily, if and only if that meowing thing is a cat. So the two are equivalent, basically. Now, one way they might be equivalent is that they're totally synonymous. That's what suggested by saying that one is just a fancy or highfalutin way of saying what one prime says. And it says they say the same thing. If it's not synonymous, then the translation ought to provide an analysis of the original statement. An analysis has to be equivalent to the original, but it might not have the exact same meaning. Like we say that Jones knows that 2 and 2 is 4 can be analyzed as Jones has a justified true belief that 2 and 2 is 4. The second statement analyzes the first, gives you an analysis of what knowledge is as a justified true belief. It doesn't seem to be synonymous with it because a person could know that he knew without knowing that he had a justified true belief. He has to learn that by taking an epistemology course. Right? Learn all those details. So the nominalist can claim either that he can provide a synonymous translation or provide an analysis. Either way, it's equivalent to the original and can be substituted for it, and eliminates the need to introduce this exotic entity of Katniss. And furthermore, by Occam's razor, provides us with a simpler overall ontology because it's an ontology that includes only concrete things, namely the meowing thing and cats. Whereas the first statement involves us with both concrete things, meowing things, and abstract things like Katniss. So they would say that's the simpler. We should go with the simplest theory. So the nominalists would say we can analyze away Katniss here and just get by saying that the meowing thing is a cat, rather than saying that Katniss is had by the meowing thing. So then the realists might come back with a second example. They might say, well, okay, you translated that one, but we have another one for you. What if we said dragonhood, which is the property had by all dragons? It's true that dragonhood is unexemplified. So what would the 2' be for the nominalist? How could they translate that? They could say that's just a fancy way of saying something that can be put into purely concrete terms and much more simply as, instead of saying dragonhood is unexemplified, we could say, what? Yeah, dragons don't exist, right? Then we're not committed to anything. It's way simpler, right? We're not saying anything exists, just that something doesn't exist. Remember, Occam's razor says the fewer things you posit to exist, the better off you are. The simplest theory is best, all other things being equal. So why not just say that there are no dragons? Dragonhood is unexemplified is just a highfalutin way of saying there aren't any dragons, which is the simpler, more economical statement, so nominalism wins. We don't need to refer to any abstract dragonhood. We can just say there are no dragons. So I'll leave you with a third example to ponder. So now the realist says, well, I got a better one for you here, which is that honesty is a virtue. So how would we translate that? Well, why don't we think about that for next time? And we'll resume on Tuesday.